this talk is not about magic, but a little bit of magic to get it on the screen. Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back in Toronto after some time and to be back at this building where I promise I will be back. How many of you know me by any chance? Not that I'm famous. I don't have any Twitch. I don't have anything. But if you work at Telos, probably you know me. Like I said, I promised I will be back. And this talk is going to be about a story. And from this story, we're going to try to revive some good memories and also give you a reason why I decided, together with another Italian, to build a company around solving those problems and going back to basically where we all started. And like Batman, I was always put on fire and tried to rescue Gotham, where Gotham has always been like the company where you were dumped and you have to build a digital platform. And just to give you a little bit of who am I, thanks, Hackman, for a great intro. You can find me anywhere on Twitter. I'm not really active. Or LinkedIn, where I'm more active with my current role. But I decided to start this company, Platformatic, with another crazy guy, Matteo Collina, that probably is more known on socials than me. But we decided to kind of take years of experience and pain and learnings into something that could be usable by everyone. And so we decided to build something fully open source and that could cater to what basically Matteo and I had to bear for many years together. I want to start with a small disclaimer. This is not a sales pitch. Even though from a CEO you would expect that, but it's just a story. And people that know me knows that I love telling stories. But I'm not here to tell you to use Platformatic, but you should. And you will know why at the end of this talk. So yeah, a little bit of commercial time. I want to start with something that my grandmother always told me. She's still alive. That life is like a spinning wheel. And I'm a nuclear physicist, and so I always kind of argue with her that thanks for stating the obvious. But what actually she meant is that everything lives in these loops. And if you look at tech is more of a spiral. And it's a spiral that can take you deep into a dark hole or out of the dark hole, right? Depending on the force that you are applying. But what is more important is that it's a very cyclic, is of a cyclic nature. So I promise you a story, so I'm going to tell you that story and take you on this journey. Every story starts with once upon a time, right? Well, that once upon a time was for me something that was not Java, but I don't want to kind of bother you with a story that goes back since I was a kid. And so let's start with Java, that probably we were born at the same time. Java and I crossed paths when I studied at MIT and when I then was at the CERN in Geneva. And something was actually very, very clear, that Java was bringing something extremely important to the world of developers. It started this kind of flow from introducing developer to the so-called developer experience of having an IDE. How many of you have coded in Java or worked in Java? So sorry for you guys. And how many of you are, because I forgot to tell you a very important piece of the story, but I tell you at the end. How many of you finally saw the light and are working in Node? Okay, and how many of you are bearing the pain of coding in Express with Node? Oh, okay. So few souls to rescue. But let's go back to Java, right? That is a bigger story. So Java was incredible, right? You have this monolithic team, all using the same IDE, Eclipse or whatever, NetBeans and whatever. You then press a play button after writing your code. There was no AI yet, so you had to write it. And it was compiling an executable, right? The so-called WAR file or the jar, basically a glorified tarball with a different extension, if they didn't tell you. And you were basically SFTPing or copying or sending or emailing in. I'm not referencing any company saying emailing a file to be deployed. And it was going on an application server, right? And that was beautiful. It was actually bringing you from A to B with the same practicality and speed of hand carrying anything from one point to another. And at the same time, everyone started building web services, right? Well, web services at the time, they were called web services. Now we call them APIs. But what actually was very, very kind of like common at the time was that they were represented by a markup language, XML. So how many of you enjoyed the beauty of importing a WSDL file and having the automatic client? Don't be shy, don't be shy, you still love it. And how many of you are missing it? Because you have been through the misery of going through the documentation, having to write your own client to connect to an API, right? Because they sold you on the SDK, thanks Facebook, never works. And then you say, the WSDL was so good. But Java, And at the same time, they invented server-side rendering. Server-side rendering was not invented by Airbnb. You all remember, right? The Airbnb backbone, Express.js, we invented server-side rendering is a lie, right? We all know it. And it's not Vercel, right? Vercel didn't invent anything. They all stole an idea, Tomcat. How many of you use Tomcat? And basically, you are building your website in Java, bam, render on the server side, boom, on the front end, and to render it would take 5-7 minutes, depending on how fast the server was. But the interesting piece is that Java was actually handling multi-threading. And multi-threading has been always something that was fascinating for developers. On one side, you don't have to care about scaling because your machine is going to scale for you. And on the other side, the very interesting thing is that our WAR file was working is that you have all your services as jar files, and then something extremely cheap, like WebLogic or WebSphere or JBoss, we're able to kind of spawn it on different processes. And voila, you have your beautiful microservices system. They invented it 30 years before microservices were ever even conceptualized. And this was great, right? Because you as a developer, be honest, you never care about the server, right? You just ship this file and say somebody else's problem, right? Great. And in all this journey, REST was getting formalized, right? So we move from an RPC model, the one that Java and so on that were promoting and running, to a more RESTful. So we thought about the concept of entities, models, right? We tried to re-look at the world from a different point of view. And at the same time, the biggest change happened. Rails. Well, Ruby on Rails. Nobody knows Rails. Everyone knows Ruby on Rails. And how many of you played with Ruby on Rails? Made a fortune out of it? Great. And Ruby on Rails is phenomenal, right? It's the best experience ever. I mean, for a person like me, was phenomenal. I just say, I want this. And bam, it was magically done, right? But it was no magic. It was creating code for me. Like, it was AI before AI. It was, any code magic system before they were even created. And it was just a simple shell script. And the experience got dramatically changed. That was a moment where everything in developer experience changed, right? Because now we describe models, and out of that, we create APIs and web pages. Wow, it was phenomenal. I mean, for me, it was like brilliant. And especially what it was able to do is that whatever was working through the Rails was done at the speed of light. Like, you could spin up your application in no time. But then as soon as you need something slightly different, good luck. It was taking forever, right? And, but the biggest revolution that we all still crave today was Heroku, right? How many of you know Heroku? I hope everyone. Okay. This talk is not sponsored by Heroku, by the way. That's what everyone tries to replicate, right? In any company where I've been, everyone dreamt about Heroku. They said, I want Heroku, but I cannot get it, right? And because it was the first approach to the cloud, to a developer-friendly cloud. It was, you were a one Git push away from getting something used by people. And you didn't have to care about environments or scalability. How many of you know what a dyno is? You think you know. But I know from the engineer number one, Blake, what a dyno is, because I thought it was a dinosaur, and it's some sort of like crazy concept in bouldering. It's a move in bouldering. And I said, oh, I can see the relation between a server and a bouldering move. But you know, that was actually incredible, because we started to describe our application more and more and more, right? So you had Unicorn at the time with your beautiful proc file, and that's how you describe your single process application inside of an application server, right? Unicorn. And everything was behind a reverse proxy, the old good Nginx, the one and only. May he rest in peace. And the nicest thing is that, you know, Ruby was able to actually run on a single process. Then you could actually multi-process and multi-thread through Juggernaut or many other systems. Or probably Tom Preston is going to kill me because I don't mention his library. But the interesting piece has been that through the proc file, you start to describing how a single process application would run inside of a multi-process container. We are coming to the point, don't worry, it's a story, right? They don't tell you who the killer is at the beginning. So, and then all of a sudden, somebody came and said, any application that can be written in JavaScript will be eventually written in JavaScript. The creator of Stack Overflow, most used website by any developer. That's where AI, ChatGPT was actually Stack Overflow. You know that. ChatGPT for developers is basically an API on top of Stack Overflow. That's what I think. But when I was working, for example, at Telos, just to mention our beautiful and lovely host of this event, thanks Telos for hosting us, one of the most common answers that I gave to my team was like, go and check on Stack Overflow, don't ask me, right? Stack Overflow knows better. And, but so in 2009, this Node.js revolution started. Nobody used Node.js at the beginning, only a few people, but it was the beginning of a transformation on the server side and APIs. And that world actually started to get transformed because now we were building an all-around car that could take us from A to B. It's not a Ferrari. I'm Italian, I need to mention them, even if I don't think it's the best car. Still, Porsche are the best car in the world. But they were not a truck. They were this kind of like utility wagon. And that's where I think the world started to transform. In good or bad, that's what we're going to discover. So the assumption is that you didn't need anything more than a process, the beginning of the end. So you have this asynchronous programming model. How many of you struggle with async programming in Node or any other language? Don't be shy, everyone. The event loop, if you want to know more about how that works, we are lucky enough to have Colin, who is a great mastermind behind some of these things possible in Node. But especially, we actually started to see that a single process could handle multiple requests per second. And that was kind of like a new assumption, a new revelation. And bam, that's it. We destroyed the monolith, because the monolith was bad automatically. But nobody really told us the story of where things started to go wrong. And they told us divide and conquer, so you can actually get this thing to a more maintainable stack. You can divide, you can separate and segregate load, you can distribute. And so that's basically how the architecture was looking like, right? And so you had these all microservices that are represented commonly by an hexagon. And Nginx was still there doing reverse proxying, right? Because I hope you never exposed Node to the open internet. And so we started to see Docker growing. Docker was becoming this new need. How can I encapsulate a process into something that I can transport from A to B, right? Because when we were working in Java or in any other language, everyone always told us, it works on my machine, right? On my machine always works. And then slowly with Docker, we saw Docker Compose. How many of you swear daily to Docker Compose? Don't be shy, because all of you that didn't raise your hand are swearing against Kubernetes. So one way or another, you're swearing to something. And we started to conceptualize the concept of mesh, right? Because now the needs were starting to change, right? We have all these isolated processes, and now they need to be somehow connected with each other. But we all know that Docker has been a great lie, and I'm close to Solomon and Sam, the two creators of Docker, and I tell them regularly about that. But it's basically, this gimmick is real, right? It works on my machine. Well, then we will ship your machine, right? And that's how Docker was born. Docker tried to solve a problem that, from a developer experience, was very compelling. I find a way to package my application into something that looks like a Word file, a tarball. By the way, a Docker image is nothing more than a tarball, because a file system tarball that gets loaded into an hypervisor. And please don't call Docker a VM. But what's the first meaning of distribution, right? We package it, we put in a Docker, we can ship it, and we have a way to describe it through my Docker file, right? Now, how many of you worked in a company, or aspire to work in a company where you enter the first day, and they tell you, we have a starter kit. And you say, OK, half of my job is done. And then you end up making a copy of this starter kit. And the first thing that you're going to change, don't lie, is the Docker file, right? Because that Docker file goes also on your production system, because your DevOps is probably not going to check it. They're going to say, oh, it's the same Docker file. It goes into production. So that's why it's a broken promise, right? And that's where we are at the point, like the advent of Kubernetes. How many of you are working on Kubernetes or work with Kubernetes, have to work, they're forced to? OK. Well, Kubernetes is a very complicated piece of technology that what it tries to do is not what they are selling you for, right? It's a scheduler, right? They tell you it's basically like Mesos or any other kind of like glorified scheduler. And on top, it gives you the opportunity to define the so-called applications. But in reality, they're just like containers, right? They're OCI containers that they run on the scheduler. And how many of you, by the way, got Kubernetes to run locally on your machine at the first try? Because you got it pre-installed, probably. So that's where the developer experience starts to crack, right? Because they give you all these promises. There's something that can work. There's something that I can isolate. I can separate the dev and ops. You are a dev, but then you need to install the ops to be a dev, and then it's not a DevOps anymore. It's out of mind, right? And then you add on top the front-end world. How many of you are front-enders? OK, because the story is very happy for front-enders. So the decoupling actually went into single-page application. Then we had the mobile. Then we had all the front-end transformation, right? And then we see that actually there is this separation between front-end logic and back-end logic. Probably I should update this slide every time that Vercel makes a release, because they continuously swap one side or another. But hey, they're happy to do what they want. Don't forget, Vercel and Next, our great friends, they changed completely the developer experience in the front end. Now, they put Heroku for the front end. How many of you are working using, forced, loving Vercel or Next.js, one of the two? Nah, come on, you love it. They give you free credits. So Vercel is great, because now you are basically one Git push away from getting anything deployed. They have branching. They allow you to have ephemeral environments, and it's phenomenal, right? So you can be in production in no time. But what about this famous digital platform? Because that's what nowadays the platform is, what developer experience is in large organizations. And especially, what is the developer experience for API developers? Because we saw the front end accelerating, but the back end has been kind of like encapsulated into these tons of layers. And I didn't want to add API gateways, or else this talk would take 7 days, right? How many of you are using Kong, or they're forced to use Kong? So first of all, Augusto and Marco are great people. I just want to say that. Beautiful product. A little bit complicated for developers. Do you agree, right? I mean, nobody understands how to use it. But they are trying to solve something that is the problem of microservices, because slowly microservices became distributed systems. And distributed systems are very complicated systems, right? They're based on on the cap theorem, right? That most of the people don't even know what that means, but that doesn't matter. Because the biggest problem is that the more you distribute with microservice, the more you have a problem of coordination, and that's where the challenge is. So you have more operator tools, right? Because now it becomes more a network problem, the so-called layer 4. And you add tons of functionalities on top of that. And developers are still left behind because the operator can accelerate there, but the developers, meh. I mean, if any of you could actually get Kong in a decent developer experience, I tried in any way. You can Google me. I use supporter of Kong, but I could never get that API ops pipeline done exactly at perfection. And so that's basically where the need became for myself and Matteo. We have been seeing this kind of like thing so many times that we said, I just want something that allows me to start fast, or if I join a company, I don't want to be bothered by all the non-functional requirements, because these ones are like blah, blah, blah for other people. I just want to build value for the company and for the customers, right? And so, especially know that there are no best practices. Java is full of best practices. If you Google Java best practice, probably you take down the internet. Node is basically no result, right? You need to feel lucky to find something. And for us, it was actually very important to be open source, because at the end of the day, it has to be something that embraces the contribution model, right? Everyone needs to be able to contribute to this, being in a company or outside of a company. And just to give you a little bit of an heads up on where we are in this journey, because I told you the story and a journey, we came to version 0.30.1. I just heard before the talk that we released a patch in the last hour. But I just want to say something. Don't be scared that it's 0.30.0. Stable. It doesn't have to be 1.0. Just imagine that it's 1.0. In the past, Matteo built a framework called Fastify. I was the main sponsor, and I loved it since the beginning because Fastify embraced exactly all these principles and needs that I need to stack the best developer experience. The things that we actually try to solve is the experience of building services, right? And building services is all about having all these non-functional pieces out of the box. And so we decided to build it like a Lego block. I wanted to build my Lego box, but I had to carry T-shirts. So you could choose between getting one of our T-shirts that you can get at the booth over there, or seeing a Lego box that I could describe. And so I went for the T-shirt. But the reality is that we try to take away all these burdens to developers. The reason is that there are so many functionalities that are part of your day-to-day bad developer experience that we said, well, we can actually streamline them, right? If you need to build an API on top of a database, we are going to do it for you. No ChatGPT needed. We build it for you. Some of the features that I really would love for you to check, if I had 6 other hours, I could describe them. But the composer is the way. How many of you built once in your life, and I know 2 people that did, a backend for the front end? So few? No, come on. Don't be shy. Yeah. It's an unbearable experience, right? Because basically you are a glorified composer. You just get OpenAPI spec from another team, and you just build a new API based on that. Because a mobile client wants only to make one call. They sold you on GraphQL. How many of you are using GraphQL? How many of you work in an enterprise that is using GraphQL publicly? 3 people, more than what I expected. But we are actually kind of like working on this kind of like feature that is already available open source, where you can get all your OpenAPI spec and compose into a single API. So you can actually go back to your manager and say, I saved your team. The last piece that I think is interesting is the engine. The engine is the way we invented this way of running microservices. And if you want to see a demo, I am, first of all, the worst person to demo because my machine runs either Office or the terminal, and I decided to go for Office. But I invite you to check a demo that Colin can give you on how the engine can compose microservices into nanoservices. It's a way that we actually reinvented and said you can develop as a distributed system, but we actually gonna bundle them into a single executable, and our engine can run it. And this actually brings us to taxonomy, one of the biggest problems in developer experience. How many of you have been searching for that API, or they told you, we're going to buy a portal so you can find those APIs, but then you manually need to register. So we actually kind of reinvented that piece and said, if you build an API, it should be auto-register. Kong doesn't do it, by the way, in case you were wondering. So where I'm going to is that what I believe the best developer experience is the one of an application server. And that's the old web logic, but for Node.js, because nothing was invented until we created it. And we actually introduced this new concept called nano-services and say you actually can run, you don't need to run tons of microservices. You can actually run a beautiful monolith that is developed in a distributed way, and we assemble it and run it for you into a nano-service. It's a very kind of interesting concept that probably would require a separate talk about because it's very theoretical. But if you want to know more about nano-services, just ping me. I'm here the whole day, and also tomorrow. And this is an example on how we envision actually the composition inside of the runtime. But what's actually kind of interesting is that what we are trying to do, we are really trying to have that I don't have to ship you my machine. I can just give you my application and it runs on our engine. And I actually want to show you briefly two things, and you are the first one to see them. So I'm going to go very fast because I'm out of time, and because it's a preview, so you cannot see it fully, right? It's a preview, right? So the first thing is that we bring back the whistle file. And there is a beautiful blog post that we wrote a couple of weeks back. So I suggested to visit blog.platformatic.dev and search for the fully typed client with no dependencies. Basically, we brought back the whistle file. And how many of you are running Next.js? Raise your hand, raise your hand. The example is based on Next.js, so no excuse for you to try it. I have your names. And we actually thought that the best way, how many of you are running Backstage? Have been scammed? Okay, 2 people, good. So we believe that the best experience for any developer is to have a wizard to create your application. Why? Because I personally hate config files. I don't say that you need to hate them, but I hate them. And the wizard is beautiful because you do click, click, next, 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 drop down, bam, bam, done, and then you blame somebody else if it doesn't work. We actually kind of like re-envision this experience. I can give you a preview. It's going to be available in probably a couple of hours, depending on the GitHub actions. Let's blame somebody else. But the idea that we had in mind on how the developer experience for building API should be is basically going through a wizard where you can create a repo, use a repo, and in a nutshell, you can connect with the database. How many of you have to connect manually to a database in your life? Yeah, that's the day that I said, but the guys in Java already did it, to have like a button in the IDE to connect to the database, and it did everything for me. Why do I need to, in Node, write my own config file? And so we said, well, we can put it in the wizard. And last but not least, you want a ChatGPT, and we give it to you. And how we give it to you is very simple. How many of you had to create manually a database, and they felt that it was a miserable job? Well, we have a solution. Use our wizard. You can actually kind of type a ChatGPT expression, and we will actually create all the schema and everything for you. If it doesn't work, you can email support@ChatGPT or OpenAI, and don't blame us. And if you're really not satisfied with the performance of the database, you can actually write your own. But the nicest thing is that it's actually showing you exactly all the steps of creation. And this thing we imagine to be very extensible and cater for anybody's need and wish. Definitely, we are working on templating, because we should have changed in this screenshot the app name, but it's for giving you an example. And I just want to kind of like close this talk that ran a little bit over, sorry, Ahmed, to say that I would really check out what we are building for 2 simple reasons. The first one is that it's highly recommended by a person that by now you should trust. But second is because we put more than 20 years of building platforms, from Epic Games to Fortune 500 companies to Talos to many others, and compress them into an experience that we believe is catered for the backend developer. And the second to the first 2, so the third, if you look in sequence, is that I know that sooner or later you will raise that best signal and call Platformatic. But now you have Batman here, so it's easier. And with that one, I want to thank you all for the patience and to listen to me, and I want to invite you to try what we are building and give us feedback. And if you don't like it, give us feedback.